totally blind. So, Clark, open your mouth and speak.
Well, the big question coming from a land as divided as the one that I live in right now, Belgium, I have to ask, which language would you like me to speak in? Because there's not one, not two, but three official languages in Belgium. There's Dutch, of course.
Wait a minute. There's 3 languages and no government, right?
There's no federal government. However, take your pick, all of the regional governments are still functioning, which is why, despite the fact that it is coming up on... In fact, we did pass a year since the last government officially fell, or was basically said we need to dissolve the government.
And that was also around it was a record, right? They set a record for the longest time without
they set the record actually before that. They beat out Iraq for the record for a country without. And, this is very interesting coming from the American perspective on this, because you think no federal government, you think Somalia. And Belgium couldn't be any more different than that, because you do have these regional governments which have an incredible amount of power to begin with. And then you have local governments which have an incredible amount of power.
Right.
So most of daily life for Belgians continues without any interruption. There are very few things that are affected by this.
And those regional, local governments operate in the language of the people who they serve, right?
Yes and no. It gets even more complicated, because there's a Flemish parliament. There's a Wallonian parliament. So the Flemish parliament would be in Flanders, which is the predominantly Dutch-speaking part. The Wallonian parliament would deal with Wallonia, which is mostly a French-speaking part. Then you have a Brussels parliament, which is the only official bilingual one. But, okay, so you have those parliaments. There are also language community parliaments that sit.
And what are they?
French language community parliament would deal with any French language speaker in the country.
What do they legislate on?
What they're there for is to advocate for the language communities of Belgium. So apart from sort of the geographical split, because you do have plenty of French speakers, I shouldn't say plenty, you have French speakers that live and or work in Flanders, in the Dutch-speaking part, and you have Dutch speakers that live and or work in the French-speaking part. And then you've got the tiny little enclave of German speakers, and they have their own little language community as well. One of the interesting things, and in my reporting, one of the things that always comes up about why do we have these splits and these issues, and why is Belgium completely unable to form a federal government, is that there are no pan-Belgian parties. So somebody from the French-speaking part, from Wallonia, they can't vote for a Flemish party. They have to vote for a Wallonian party. So there's like there's the Flemish Greens and the Wallonian Greens.
You mean it's not on their electoral roll?
No, they can't. Oh. And people point to this as part of the reason why it's impossible at this point. I mean, the deal would be that you've officially created a de facto two-country situation.
Yeah, no wonder people are saying this is no longer a country.
But I think more interesting for your listeners, I mean, language threads its way through this, and the language, of course, is intricately tied with the culture. You have that linguistic divide is also a huge cultural divide between Northern European, Dutch-speaking, Germanic, and Southern-speaking, Romantic, French. And a lot of people will also say that fundamentally that is a clash that is an accident of history, a part of Holland that nobody wanted and a part of France that nobody wanted. So they created this country, and they said, strength through unity, which is the motto of the country. But then they went, and when they actually got around to running the country, realized it wasn't going to work, and have been tiptoeing around it ever since, and creating these regional governments and regional parliaments and language parliaments, and trying to sort things out that way. And what they've done is basically created a de facto two-country situation anyway.
So what does that mean for you now living there? As soon as you leave Brussels, do you have this sense that you're entering different countries?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Because Brussels is its own thing.
Right.
And it's this little tiny slice that sticks up into Flanders. It's basically surrounded by Flanders for the most part. And Brussels is the only place where you have to have street signs in both languages. And you can take tram rides that will take you out. I mean, you don't have to get on a big train to get into Flanders. You can just do a short little tram ride. The minute you cross that line, you know it because you don't see any more signs in French. The French signs are gone. It's all in Dutch.
Schools taught only
No, well, this is a big sticking point. Historically, French was the language of power, full stop. So you speak to people who grew up in Flanders, and it's, my grandparents were never allowed to speak Dutch. Now we're going to speak Dutch. At the same time, they'll tell you that we, the Flemish, the Dutch speakers, we're the ones who from the age of 10 learn how to speak French. So whenever we come across a French-speaking Wallonian, it's always us that's making the effort. They don't learn Dutch down in Wallonia. And that's a horrific overstatement, but it is really true. The Flemish are very sort of out in front as far as learning another language.
I suppose you could make the argument that French is a more important global language to learn than Dutch.
It is, but this is all becomes political too, because in the midst of all of this Dutch versus French stuff, you had educators in Flanders saying, "Oh yeah, well now French is going to be the third language. English is going to be our second language, and we're just not going to learn as much French as we used to." The interesting part is you do get into situations where you get Flemish and Wallonians together, and instead of using one or the other as the common language, they'll switch into English.
Neutral,
which is a little bit weird.
Yeah, it's strange.
But then my experience there is the whole thing is kind of strange.
Yeah. So I don't know for how long I've been reading about how Belgium can't go on like this. There's this linguistic divide, no government more recently. Can it go on like this? I mean, it seems as like it's going on perfectly fine right now.
I think there's a variety of levels to that. Yes, day to day, it's very hard to tell that anything is amiss. Most people's lives are going along. If you are waiting on the federal government to move like on immigration paperwork or something like that, if you're an immigrant in the country, then you're feeling it pretty hard because these are the decisions that are not getting made. There's a caretaker government in place, but they're only taking care. They're not planning anything. They're not, to me, the weirdest part of the situation was crystallized in the fact that Belgium is obviously assisting NATO in operations in Libya. And the Belgians are pointing out, now, wait a minute, we're a country without a federal government ousting a country that has a government? How can we do that?
Yeah.
It's a weird situation, and it is a weird situation.
Presumably the operational language of NATO is English, right?
I would imagine, yes. Yeah. Yes. I think the best explanation of it is, to me, and there would be Belgians who disagree with setting it up this way, but it makes sense to me, is the cost of divorce higher than the cost of staying together? Like I was saying, the linguistic divide is a symptom of a larger cultural divide. And the interesting thing is I already talked about how they separate parliaments. They also separate media. Any television shows produced in Wallonia only run on Wallonian television. Any shows produced in Flanders only run on Flemish television. Neither of those sets are translated into the other language, or dubbed or subtitled or anything. The only thing those two countries have in common is that they maybe both watch CSI. And the Flemish would want to watch that with subtitles because they like to practice their English, and the Wallonians, of course, would want it dubbed. So you've created a media landscape which basically leads to Wallonians don't know anything about Flemish authors, Flemish musicians, Flemish artistic community at all. The Flemish don't know anything about the Wallonian authors, artists, musicians, anything. There's no shared culture. The only thing that would be shared would be they both know, the latest Madonna track or whatever like that. It's to me, the more I interview people about that, the more I think that's a huge part of this puzzle. The fact that you've separated the media like that there is no shared culture for people to latch onto and say, this is Belgian, apart from beer, chocolate, fries. I mean, these are the tropes that you always fall back on, and when you write about it, or people, even when Belgians talk about it,
fries. You actually mentioned fries the other day, and the word for fries
in Dutch it's frietjes.
So they use the French and then they add a Dutch ending.
Yeah. So they add the little JES at the end of that. It's like a diminutive, which is how you kind of soften Dutch a little bit.
Would they say that? Would they use that in the Netherlands? Or do they have their own word for it?
preaches there as well.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So, it's not just a sort of...
Although, the more I'm up in Flanders, the more I realize that it is very much a dialect of Dutch. It's very much its own dialect.
But they don't necessarily have an additional number of loanwords from French because at least...
You do find places in Brussels where there was a mixing of the two languages to a greater extent than what you see now. There was a part of Brussels called the Marolles, which is famous for this sort of patois, and you still see bits and pieces of it around town. In fact, there's a nice little chain of restaurants, which I quite like, called Skive Lavabo. Now, you'll notice lavabo is actually a Spanish word. So this was not just a patois of French and Dutch. This was a patois of numerous European languages. And Skive Lavabo means like crooked sink. And to put crooked in front of something, the skive part, to put crooked in front of something in Dutch, and I'm apologizing to Dutch listeners because one Dutch person described me trying to speak and or write Dutch as it's like my dog suddenly being able to talk. Very typically direct Dutch, telling me, please don't try to type. Please don't try to write Dutch words or try to speak the Dutch language. Okay. But I'm going to try it anyway because this is a good story. So skive is like crooked. And the worst thing you can call somebody in this part of the world is like a skive architect, crooked architect. That's like actually pretty powerful, nasty thing to call somebody because it all goes back to the fact that like architects came in and tore down all these old neighborhoods and built all these like fancy new buildings. And so it's still in people's memory that to call somebody like crooked. But in this part of town, you still see this kind of patois, but it's dying out. It's become this thing that people just write academic papers on. You know, not that it's bad to write academic papers, but as a living, breathing dialect, kind of interesting. Well, look here. Somehow they were able to sort of get these two languages together in some form to communicate with each other. You just don't see that anymore.
You mentioned immigration. I wonder if that is the other thing, along with the rise of English, that might presumably, when immigrants come, if the federal government ever signs the papers and gets to come. I mean, immigrants are coming from outside of Europe for the most part, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
Do they want to learn French? Do they want to learn Dutch? Do they come in and speak English, the neutral language?
Well, you get a lot of people coming from French-speaking backgrounds to begin with into the country. But I have seen situations where it all depends on what part of the country they end up moving to and living in and working in. If they end up living and working in Flanders, they're going to end up speaking some Dutch. And if they end up in Brussels, chances are pretty good they're going to be in French. And if they're in Wallonia, it's going to be French. But let's face it, the Flemish economy is much stronger than the Wallonian economy right now. So a lot of these people are moving out to Flanders to find work. And like the second generation that are there are moving out to live in these places, which is causing some interesting backlash because you've never really had that in Flanders before, and people are figuring out how they're going to deal with that.
Well, they'll be finding out about this particular immigrant boy.
Probably you're going to get a serious feedback from your Dutch listeners about this. This stuff is taken incredibly serifully.
Oh, I'm sure.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's taken very seriously by some folks.
Yeah.
There's also a Belgian sense of humor. I mean, if I actually had to point to one thing that I think everything that we've talked about here, you talk about shared. What's shared? Total sense of surrealism, because they live in this surreal place.
Oh, right. Magritte, the painter, and that's still alive and across the linguistic divide?
Complete, and it's the same trope in the way that beer and chocolate and frites are. It's always the question, so, what's it like living in a country with no government well, it's the land of Magritte, so it's surreal, so what did you expect from us?
Right.
So I've got at least 20 people on tape saying that. I could just do a little montage of all the people who have told me that. Always you'll hit the moment where you're interviewing people and you say, ask a question about how does it work. Oh, Clark, it's complicated. It's always complicated. It's just like that is the word that I would use to describe the whole thing, complicated. And I'm sure that plenty of the things that I've said here are probably not quite right, but that's because most Belgians couldn't explain it to you either.
Yeah. When you say it's complicated, that reminds me of the Balkans. And in a way, maybe what it is Yugoslavia without the guns.
That is exactly how I've heard people describe this. I don't think there's the level of ethnic hatred. Are Belgians going to take to the streets with guns and weapons? No, because everybody's too busy enjoying their 2.5-hour lunch. The quality of life is good. There's less economic pressure in a place like that. You know, by and large, there's no federal government, but people are pretty happy.
Sounds like you want to get back there.
Yeah, now that I think about it, when's my plane leave?
Well, Clark, that was great. Thanks.
You're welcome, Patrick.
And there's more fun with Clark in